In this video, we're going to look at a very old hiding place in the Rocky Mountains, somewhere where men a very long time ago had hid something of value to them. And this is known as a cache site. And lucky for us, there's 3 clues that have been left behind. So we're going to take a look at all 3 clues and see if we can't solve the mystery and figure out who was hiding stuff at this site way back in the olden days. What we're going to do is we're going to look at each clue very quickly, so this way you guys know what we're working with, and then we'll come back and we'll investigate each one of these clues independently. So the first clue, and we'll call this clue number 1, is this Indian petroglyph. And the second clue is right next to it. And right here you have another glyph, and you got a square with a humanoid figure in the center of it, and we'll call this clue number 2. Man, it's starting to get cold out here. So right over here we have our third and final clue. And you have some very old looking script right here. So we'll call this clue number 3. And then right over in this area, that is where the cache site is, but we'll look at it last. All right, and this brings us to clue number 1. And before we get started, just so everyone understands, there's nobody alive today, there's nobody I'm aware of who even claims to have this knowledge. Nobody can interpret these old Indian petroglyphs. The people who made these are long gone, and that knowledge, unfortunately, it's been lost to history. But that being said, anthropologists, archaeologists working with, different tribal elders in the last 50 years, they really came to a deeper understanding of these Indian petroglyphs. An example would be like your Indian sign language. All your different Indian tribes, they spoke different languages, had different cultures, different religions, different ceremonies, different ways of viewing the world. But one thing many of them shared in common was this Indian sign language, and that's how they could communicate with each other when they didn't speak each other's language. So what these scholars have found by studying thousands of these petroglyph sites is that a lot of times the Indian sign language is depicted in the petroglyph, using like animals and different symbology. So it's very fascinating stuff. This right here, this has been scratched in V4CE. That's probably when like archaeologists will document a petroglyph. Part of the way they'll catalog it, they have this numerical system. So a lot of times they'll etch a number next to it, or sometimes they'll paint the number on the rock. I don't know why they do that. It's an eyesore, but that's probably what this is. It's part of their cataloging system for this particular petroglyph. Now you'll notice like this is scratched, and that's how modern people, carve into rocks. Even your cowboys in the 1800s, when they'd leave the cowboy glyphs, they would often scratch. But your Indians, they had a different style. They would peck the rock, they would chip the rock, and that's how they created these images. I don't know why they did that, but that's just how they did it. So I want to show you something, and this is a book written by Carol Patterson. She's a PhD anthropologist. Probably one of my favorite anthropologists. She spent more time in the American Southwest studying Indian petroglyphs than anybody I know. Her work is very fascinating. I highly recommend, if you're into this kind of stuff, that you research her work. But Carol and other scholars, the symbol that we're looking at, and this is a common symbol, by the way. I found probably, 20, 30 of these, this exact symbol located across the states of Colorado and Utah. But how her and others have come to understand the symbol is it means to go down, to descend. And so right here where we're at a crossroads in this canyon. And if you go that way, you go up, you follow the trail up and you continue up the mountain. If you go this way, you follow the trail down the mountain. This is the old Indian trail. And so you descend. So we're going to do exactly what the symbol says. We're going to descend, we're going to go down the trail, and we'll see what we find. So as we descend down the trail, it brings us to this beautiful little stream right here, a great source of water. And you can only imagine centuries ago, you know, the Indian women coming down this trail, bringing their children with them, coming down here to collect water, the water that they would need for cooking and cleaning and other domestic uses. The men coming down here to water their horses before they headed out hunting. And back then, how they carried water, the Indians, is they would use the stomach of an animal, usually buffalo, and they would sew these stomachs together, and that's how they were able to carry and store water. All right, so just like we have signs and symbols on our trails in modern times, so do the Indians. And this is just a symbol letting the Indians know to continue down the trail and they'll find something important, in this case, water. So this clue, in my opinion, has nothing at all to do with the cache site. In fact, this petroglyph was probably here hundreds of years before Europeans even stepped foot in this country. All right, and that brings us to clue number 2. And this clue is most definitely the key we need to solve to unlock this mystery. So this has been done in the old way, in the Indian way. It's been chipped into the rock, but I think that was done to mislead. This does not look like your typical Indian petroglyph. It doesn't have that kind of feel to it. This looks like it has most definitely a European influence. And so let's start with the square. Now the square, traditionally, in many cases, that's been used to represent that something is buried nearby, something is concealed, something is hidden. So think of it like this. Think of the square as representing like a hole in the ground where you're then bury something, or think of it as representing a box, you know, that you're going to put something into. And then we have the figure. So if you'll notice, his upper body is tilted slightly forward. One of his arms is directly behind him, pointed at a downward angle. His feet are like this. So he is in motion. He's in movement. And so this is a figure of a man who is fleeing something. This is the figure of a man who's in motion. He's in movement. And then, of course, you have the outstretched hand, which is pointing you in which direction to go in. So I think to solve the mystery of this glyph, we're going to have to go back to the 1600s in Europe. So men have been wearing hats for a very long time. There's depictions in ancient Greece that date back thousands of years of men wearing hats. And in the olden days in Europe, if you were a hat maker, if that was your profession, you were called a hatter. And in order to be a hatter, you had to belong to a guild. And this guild was known as the Hatters Guild. And these hatters, oftentimes, they were known for being very eccentric, very crazy. And back then they couldn't figure out why, but we know the reason why in modern times. So these hatters, they would work with different types of animal furs. And one of the ways they would process these furs is they would take mercury, a batch of mercury, and they would dilute it with acid. And then they'd put these animal furs in there. So they'd sit there all day long, just mixing up this batch of mercury, acid, and animal furs. And they're breathing in all these toxic fumes. Well, eventually this would start to have an impact on them. And at first they'd get the shakes really bad. And they used to call that the hatter's shakes. And then that would progress and they would start to suffer from hallucinations. Their manner of speech, it would be very hard to understand them. Their speech would be very jumbled, or they'd speak very quickly. And the character, the Mad Hatter in the fictional story of Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter is based on this piece of history, on that time period. That's why he's, in the cartoon, the storybook tale, he's a little bit crazy, because that's how hatters were known back then. And so these hatters, they ended up coming up with a very ingenious way to make a very beautiful hat out of a beaver. And these beaver hats were like a status symbol, and they were very valuable. And it took around 3 to 4 beaver, depending on the quality of fur, to make one beaver felt hat. And these beaver felt hats, they became like family heirlooms. They would get passed on from father to son throughout the generations. It looks like somebody's been out here messing around. They made themselves a little hut. It almost looks like a beaver lodge. So we'll go in there and we'll talk about how the hatters made a hat out of a beaver. How did that process work? Well, it's kind of cozy in here. It's not bad. Be a nice little spot to get out of the rain if you had to, if you were in a pinch. So beaver hats, it's actually kind of cool, the process of how they made them. So a lot of us, when we think of the beaver hat, we think they were making it out of the leather, because it's a very soft leather, and they dyed the leather, and that's what they made the hat out of. But that's not how it worked. The leather did get used. It was a byproduct, and they would sell the leather, and because it's a nice soft leather, and they would make gloves out of the leather or glue. And so when you look at a beaver, all that outer fur, that was a waste product. They would pluck that out. But underneath that outer fur, you have another inner layer of fur. It's called the under fur. And this under fur is, it's very soft, a very thick, matted layer of fur. And this under fur, it has the individual hair follicle has like a barb on it. Think of like a fish hook. And so what these hatters found is if you took this under fur and you applied heat, pressure, and moisture, these barbs on the individual hair strands would interlock with each other, kind of very similar to how Velcro works. And this would create this very smooth, naturally water resistant felt type material, and it would make a very beautiful hat. And that's why these beaver felt hats were popular for so very long. So what ended up happening was these beaver felt hats, they stayed in style for nearly 200 years, from the mid 1600s to the mid 1800s. They were eventually replaced by the silk hat, which was a very good thing, because during this 200-year time period, the beaver were trapped nearly to extinction. We almost lost the beaver. What happened was, initially at first, all of the beaver were trapped in Europe. Europe had a rich source of beaver. Well, it didn't take long, and eventually the beaver in Europe were trapped nearly to extinction. So after that, then they set their sights on areas like Russia where they would import beaver. And then pretty soon the beaver in areas like Russia were being trapped out. Then after that, they set their sights on the eastern woodlands of the North American continent. Then pretty soon those beaver were trapped out. So by the time Lewis and Clark went on their epic journey out here to the western United States in the year 1804, all eyes were fixated on the Rocky Mountains in areas just like this, the rivers, the streams, as a new source of beaver. And there were many men, many adventurers who came out here during that time period. They were very brave, very reckless, very daring. They endured a tremendous amount of hardship. Many of them would die within the first 2 years, but many of them would also live on to become legends. And now we call that group of men the mountain men. So this is the time when you had the age of the mountain man. So if I had the ability to travel back in time and I could experience any time period, live with any group of men, I would most definitely go live with the mountain men. In my opinion, in all of Americana, it's the most interesting piece of history that we have. It is very fascinating, the things that these men encountered and witnessed, the experiences that they had. They got to see everything and experience it while it was still untouched in its natural beauty. A very beautiful time period. And so these mountain men, they were a very diverse group. You had your Americans, and a lot of the Americans are the more famous mountain men, but you had your Americans, you had your Canadians, you had your French, you had your British, you had your Spanish. And despite common misconceptions, many of these men were very educated. They could read and write. They kept detailed journals. They spoke multiple languages. Some of them could even read and write in Latin. They're probably the most famous for their rendezvous. And the rendezvous was a gathering held once a year, usually in the spring or the summer. And it consisted of your mountain men and your Indians. And you'd have traders like William Ashley who would bring trade goods out to these men. And this gave them an opportunity to sell their beaver pelts and to get restocked up with valuable supplies and stuff like that. And there was a lot of alcohol involved. And for about a 2-week period, these men would just get drunk and party every day. There was a lot of gambling involved. There's a lot of fighting involved. They would have contests like shooting contests and horse racing. And, you know, there'd be Indian women. A lot of Indian women would attend the rendezvous. And so there was a lot of, sexual encounters taking place. It was just, it was probably some of the wildest parties that took place west of the Mississippi River for centuries, right? But a very fascinating time, and a lot of legends and a lot of stories surrounding the rendezvous. The mountain men looked forward to the rendezvous all year long. It was one of the things they lived for. Another thing they're famous for is their storytelling abilities. They were very good storytellers. That's how they would entertain themselves. And these stories, they're very colorful, exaggerated oftentimes or embellished. And these stories were known as yarns. And so in modern times, when you're reading the stories of the mountain men, it's kind of hard to tell or separate fact from fiction, but that's part of the fun. But in many ways, they were proved true. So when the fur trade ended and the mountain men who survived long enough to head back east or wherever they were from, they were known for telling these yarns, these elaborate stories. So when they would tell people about what they had seen, what they had experienced out here in the Rocky Mountains, oftentimes they'd be ridiculed or laughed at. but the mountain men had the last laugh. So like some examples would be, they would talk about these gigantic trees that were so large you could fit a house inside of them, and they reached up to the heavens. And of course, people laughed and said that's impossible. There's no way trees could be that big. Well, of course, nowadays we know those trees as the redwoods. They would talk about this very mysterious, superstitious place where the sulfur and the vapors of hell reached up to the earth day and night. And people laughed at them and said, that's impossible. There's no place on earth like that. Well, now, of course, we know that area as Yellowstone National Park. They would talk about seeing forest of trees that God had cursed and he had turned to stone. And of course, people laughed at that and they said, that's impossible. There's no way. That's just the yarn of a mountain man. But we now know areas like that as Petrified Forest National Park. So in many ways, the mountain men were vindicated. They really did see and experience everything they write about. Our mountain men, probably more so than any other group of people, were known for making cache sites, for hiding their valuables. And there's many practical reasons for this. So if you envision the life of a mountain man, they were almost like gypsies, meaning that they carried around all of their worldly possessions with them. And so they not only carried around all the usual stuff, like their bedding, their food, tobacco, coffee, cooking utensils, guns, knives, lead for making bullets, gunpowder, all the usual stuff. If that wasn't bad enough, they had to carry around all these beaver pelts and the traps they needed to capture the beaver. So they could only move very slowly. And for reasons like that, they would frequently make cache sites. So they would temporarily hide their belongings if they needed to travel a long distance, if they needed to move quickly, especially if they knew they were coming back to that area at a future point in time. A lot of times they would cache and hide their beaver pelts, and it was kind of like an old way of banking. They would hide their beaver pelts, and this way they didn't have to risk those beaver pelts being stolen, either by the Indians or by other mountain men. And a lot of times it was just out of pure necessity. When they were attacked by the Indians, they would have to quickly cache their goods so they could travel more quickly, which brings us back to clue number 2. So back then you had two different types of mountain men. The first type was called your free trapper, and they worked entirely for themselves. They were beholden to no one. They could go where they pleased and do as they pleased. Most of your trappers were not free trappers. They were what was referred to as company trappers, meaning they worked for one of your fur companies, like the American Fur Company or the Hudson Bay Company. And these fur companies, they ran a very rigid structure. It's very similar to the military in many regards. It's starting to get windy, so I'm trying to get out of the wind. And so how it worked with them is they would create what's called a brigade. And this would consist of usually like around 15, 20 mountain men. And they would assign a commander to each brigade. And this commander was called a boozway. And so they would send this brigade out to new areas to explore and search for beaver to exploit. And so when a brigade would arrive in a new area, sometimes the commander, he would send a smaller group of men to go and explore. So say, he might say like you're in charge, get 4 men and go up this stream and see if you can find any sign of beaver, report back in 2 days. And so in this area where we're at, back during those days, there were many mountain men in this area. That's very well documented. In fact, Kit Carson himself spent a lot of time in this area. And I think it was a brigade, a group of mountain men who built this cache site and who left that symbol. And I think what happened is they came into this area. The Boozway sent some men to explore up that stream, the same stream we looked at earlier where the Indians were gathering water. They got ambushed. Some of the men were probably wounded. They were very bad off. They had to hurry and cache their supplies because they needed to get back to the brigade, to get back to safety. But they had to mark the cache site so this way other members of the brigade could come back here and retrieve these vital supplies. So knowing what we know of the mountain men, knowing that we know they were in this area, let's view this symbol through that lens and see what we come up with. So we had to flee the area, so we cached our goods over in that direction. And that's how I've come to understand this symbol, and everything fits together very nicely. It matches the time period, matches the circumstance. And so let's take a look at clue number 3. All right, so this brings us to clue number 3, the script that looks very old. So let's start with the rock. This is sandstone, and when I rub my fingers like that and I rub them together, I can feel the little grit from the quartz, the feldspar, you know, the other material that was cemented together to create this rock. So this rock, it's very brittle. It's more of a softer rock. So this has the appearance of age, but it's really not very old. So when you look at it from this angle, right here, you have a C and a U, and then 74. This is the logo for the University of Colorado. And then, of course, 1974. So what's happened is probably sometime back in the 70s, somebody found this site. They told somebody about it at the university. The university came out here, probably the archaeological department. They did a quick little investigation of the site. And when they were all finished, some of the students put the school logo and the date here on the rock. And I know that sounds odd to do something like that, you know, next to a possible archaeological site, but this is the 1970s, you know, and it was a different time period. So our mountain men, they picked a very brilliant location to use as a cache site. Most of the cache is hidden by these large boulders. And then this is the only part of this canyon, and I've been up and down the canyon, where you have these cottonwood trees growing. And so envision back then, they come down this old Indian trail, following this canyon to that stream. They head up the stream, they're ambushed, they have to retreat, they make their way back through this canyon, and they specifically chose this spot for good reason. If they would have made a cache anywhere else, say like in the trees or the bushes, they would have disturbed the soil. They would have left footprints. The Indians would have quickly have found that cache. And for the Indians back then to find a cache like that, you know, that's like winning the lottery. And this, where you have this massive rock slide, This is the only place in this entire canyon where you have a rock slide like this. This was a perfect spot to build a really quick temporary cache. They could get in here, do the work they needed to do, and they'd leave no evidence, no footprints, no nothing. And so let me show you what remains of the old cache. Try to get a bird's eye view. But really neat looking. Right up here, looks like you have the remains of some petrified wood right here, and looks like a piece spill out right here. Well, that's pretty cool looking. But let me get up here and give you another view. So, you know, like I said, you have this rock slide everywhere. You have rocks, except for right here where they removed all the rocks. And trust me, this is no geological anomaly or anything like that. This has been man-made. The rocks and stuff that are in here have been carried out of here on purpose. So it's very fascinating. Whether there's anything left in here or not, I doubt it. I almost guarantee they came back, got all the goods, got everything they needed. If there was anything left in here when the University of Colorado did their field work, you know, they would have, I'm sure, found it. But it's a very neat place, one of those hidden places. But you know, it'd be cool to go back in time and see exactly how this looked. You know, once they put their stuff in here, you know, they dug it all out, then you have all these cottonwood trees around here that are growing. You know, they would grab the branches and leaves, the bark from the cottonwood, and just very cleverly concealed their stash. The mountain men were very good at making caches. They were probably the best there ever was. And I think that's exactly what they did right here. So based on the known history of this area, the few clues that have been left behind, this is my understanding, my interpretation of this site. Without being able to go back in time, you know, it's impossible to know with 100% certainty what took place at this site. If you have your own theory or your own ideas, feel free to put it down in the comments. And with that being said, as always, thanks for watching, and until next time.